Welcome to the Prevention Collaborative's Conversation podcasts. In these episodes, our staff and partners will cover the most pressing issues relevant to the violence prevention field. Our discussions cover a wide range of topics, including feminism, poor mental health, sustainable funding, and much more. Stay informed and inspired within the prevention of violence against women and children space. Start listening to join the conversation today. In this episode, Joy Watson speaks to Nadia Ahidjo from the African Women's Development Fund as part of the Investing Wisely interview series to document funders' best practices.
So, Nadia, thank you for chatting with me today. And as mentioned, we really are trying to examine models of best practice of where funders have gotten it right to provide and deploy funding in ways that are just meant to subvert sort of traditional approaches to funding, in ways that are meant to break down the power relationships between funders and grant recipients. So maybe we can start a bit by you telling us about the work of the African Women's Development Fund.
Thank you for having me, Joy. The African Women's Development Fund is a feminist fund that has existed since the year 2000, when three amazing African feminists realized that no money was coming to women's rights organizations on the African continent. And so they constituted this fund to be able to directly resource African women's rights organizations. And I think the value add of AWDF as a feminist fund, like many other global South-feminist funds, is that it's more than just the money. We see resourcing as a financial and a political tool. And so we invest in knowledge, we invest in solidarity and care for our movements and our partners. And we also invest in the agency and resilience of organizations and individuals that we resource, leveraging various tools. AWDF is also at an exciting time because we just launched our new 10-year strategic framework, which really revisits how we think about our ecosystems on the African continent. We will no longer resource around themes. In the past, we used to work on, bodily health and rights, which is where the bulk of our portfolio around violence against women and girls sat. And now we've said, you know what, people don't live single issue lives, and there's no reason why funding should be single issued and box people into themes. And so we have made the decision to now fund around strategic priorities. And these are resourcing, knowledge and narratives, which we're calling knowledge and voice, agency and resilience, which is where really we support organizations to learn, different skills around financial management, organizational stuff. We also have a pillar around strategic influencing of the philanthropic ecosystem, because for us, it's a movement. We do this with others, and we'd like others to also think differently about how they resource women's rights organizations on the continent.
I mean, I'm very fascinated by what you're saying, Nadia, and particularly those words. They're very exciting. Philanthropic movement. Maybe just before we go on, just explain what you mean by that. How are you within that concept thinking about the broader ecosystem of how we fund?
So AWDF, interestingly, sits in various consortiums with other sister funds, for example, through the Leading from the South consortium, as a member of the Prospera network of international women's funds. And so in these spaces, I think we see that, the work of resourcing movements globally cannot be limited to one fund or one organization or one way of doing things. And it's important for philanthropic entities within the ecosystem, whether you are a fund, a feminist or other kind of fund, whether you're an individual philanthropist, whether you're a corporate philanthropist, etc., to network together, to understand the ecosystem together for movements, to listen to movements and to be in service of movements in how you resource, but also how the flows or the funds get to the entities that you're seeking and the issues that you're seeking to impact. We also had a steering committee of badass African feminists who really, called us back to order when we were doing things the not so feminist way, or at least not in alignment with our African feminist values. As a philanthropic actor seeking to positively impact a space or an issue, there's so much that you need to do differently in terms of how you center movements, right? In even just developing your strategy, for example. And so I think those are the kinds of things we want to share with others. And those are the others that we call the philanthropic ecosystem.
Snoddy, the Investing Wisely initiative at the Prevention Collaborative is specifically trying to look at how funding is deployed largely from the global north to the global south, and how the power relationships between funders and grant recipients impacts upon program design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We're trying to understand what are the things that restrict better programming or limit better programming, and what are the things that enable it in terms of how funding is deployed. What would you say are the key challenges in the funding ecosystem that inhibit effective VALG prevention specifically?
I mean, we are very short-minded, right? People get funding for projects for a year, 2 years. If you're lucky, you'll get a 3-year funding. But essentially, we're trying to solve a complex issue within a project time frame that is not realistic in any way, shape, or form. That's the first point. I think the other point also that we often find is that funders are not often in service, or they don't center movements as much as they should. You often find organizations or entities or individual activists trying to align their programming or their work to the funder's strategy or the funder's country of interest or strategic priorities. And then within that, then maneuvering and navigating to get the work done that needs to be done in the way that it needs to be done, as opposed to funders saying, look, you work on violence against women and girls in this specific context. What do you need, right? And how can the finances resource you to be able to do what you need to do in the way that it needs to be done, while acknowledging that systemic change takes time? What we find is that many of the partners that we have tell us, look, just give us long-term funding, make it, don't restrict it, make it flexible. And in that, there's also the relationship, because there's so much in terms of how the power dynamics between funders and movements show up in funding prevention in this sense. And so when that dynamic is in the middle of the relationship, then it cannot work, right? Because you have the people with the money, essentially. I'm making it a bit too simple, but that's what it is. And then the others just trying to align so that they receive the money. And so there's also this thing of, I don't know, we're trying to fit people's lives into results frameworks. And the issues are way more complex than that, right?
Nadia, I'm also thinking that, you working predominantly on the African continent, and as we know, there's a rich legacy of colonialism and extraction. And now, we're looking to how to work on the continent and sourcing aid from the powers that have resources. What do you think is particular to the African continent that we need to think about in trends, social and political trends in funding that impacts how and where money goes, and what the priorities are and what the priorities are not?
It's a hard question, and there isn't like one answer to it, right? But some of the things that we're seeing, number one is global trends usually tend to effectively impact our trends. When you're seeing the rollback on rights that's happening in countries like the US, in some European countries, etc., around reproductive rights and other kinds of rights, they are directly influencing our continent in terms of, for example, funding that folks used to receive that they no longer receive, in terms of our countries and policymakers tightening up our spaces, restricting our funding, restricting even when or how we can receive funding, for big and for small organizations aside. So I would say there are the global trends. There's also Um, I know not to be politically incorrect, but there's also racism, right? Let's be honest. Most global North funders trust global North organizations and entities to resource in global South context. To be trusted as a global South organization, whether you are a fund that has existed for 24 years or one that's been in existence for 4 years, uh, the level of trust that is extended is not the same. Let me put it that way. And there's a lot of mobilization that Global South feminist funds have done in the past that have tried to shift the needle around that. I think I will really highlight here the Leading from the South consortium, where the Dutch government took a bold step with its feminist foreign policy to say, look, we're gonna fund these feminist funds from the Global South directly, and it's going to work, and it's working, right? It's worked for the last few years. It's working in this phase as well. Something also that we shy away from is that I think feminist funds, and I speak from this perspective because this is my background, is that feminist funds and women's funds tend to speak the language of gender justice and gender equality and feminist issues that is very well understood in certain circles, but not in others. So where we have the capacity to mobilize even more resources to go to our context, we speak a language that is not accessible to others, that is not understood by others. You'll see that at AWDF, what we try to do is to really prioritize community engagement and participation in what we fund, advocacy that's culturally sensitive, and also just looking at how we're looking at the unique challenges that communities face before we even, determine how best to resource them.
See, in fact, we have we've designed a survey that targets both donors and grant recipients to ask about the challenges that they experience, again, in that relationship between funding practice and how, to what extent prevention programs are successful or not. And some of the things that you raise now and earlier already have emerged quite as significant issues. So things around when you adapt programs and there's not proper consultation with local communities, not being in touch with the community's needs. The issue you raised around flexible and core funding, so a lot of what you are saying comes out through the survey. And what I wanted to check in with you about is, how does the African Women's Development Fund try to be innovative and different and feminist in the way that it funds? What are the specific strategies that you employ?
Yeah. I think one thing that we always try to do is to leverage existing networks and collaborate with local organizations that are already working on sexual violence, right? So we would rarely ever or never actually go into a context and start something new. We would rather go into the context, find out, who are the people and which are the organizations that are working on sexual violence, share more about, the funds that we have available, how we resource organizations in the other countries or communities or contexts, and then bring these people to then apply for funding from us. So I think for us, the outreach and the relationship building is really central to the work. We do have your more formal call for proposals that we launch on our websites, but they are mostly often always accompanied by a prior engagement and conversation within a community and with networks that already exist and organizations that are already doing the work. I think the other thing is that as much as possible, we try to center, the African Feminist Charter in how we show up in spaces, right? I think for us, it's very important to be aware of the power dynamics, to ensure, like the contextual and respectful connections with other feminist and women's rights movements in those spaces are central to how we engage. And I think another thing is that we do our best to celebrate the wins with communities. And so there've been a number of policy wins in Africa, especially like in the 2000s, much less now, unfortunately. And so we've documented that with partners. We have guides that we develop, like we have a a guide that we developed a few years ago specifically for organizations and entities working on violence against women and girls.
So, Nadia, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that as I talk to you and others who are pretty reflexive in how you look back at yourselves in terms of how you show up in spaces, what the power dynamics are between you and those that you fund. And because of that, there are all these innovations. The Equality Fund was talking to me, for example, about how they sometimes accept reports via WhatsApp and different formats of reporting, videos, and instead of just written narratives and so on. But what I sometimes hear is that it is not quite possible to replicate these innovations with bilaterals. So how do we get our heads around thinking about, yes, for sure, it's public money and there need to be certain measures around that, but how can we dare to dream about bilateral funding that might look a bit different? I'm sorry, that's an impossible question, but what are your thoughts?
I love that you brought up the Equality Fund because they're a strong partner for AWDF. I think the one thing is to, we are so scared of bilateral funders that we stop seeing them as people. We see the machinery instead of the program officers that we are building relationships with to move the needle on an issue. And I think that removing that lens of the bureaucracy and the machinery and focusing on the relationship is something that has helped us at AWDF. We don't think about it in ways of, oh, we're going to do away with all of the checks and balances, because that's a whole system and it's a whole machinery that is way beyond our power to be able to completely shift and change for a number of reasons, right? They are accountable to their taxpayers, et cetera, et cetera. But what we can shift is how people who work within the machinery think about working with women's funds, feminist funds, Global South organization, and then carry that advocacy internally with the others who have more power and influence to change things. You are successful with some, you're not successful with others, but I think also when you're thinking about systemic change at that level, you know that it's a long game, and the relationship building is central to that with the program officers, because at the end of the day, the people who you work with within the bilateral agencies, they do believe in the same issues as you, right? They trust you as a fund. That's why you're their partner. But they are also challenged by the internal machinery that they have to contend with and sometimes fight with on behalf of their grantee partners. So this is how we approach it, at AWDF.
It's a very useful way of sort of thinking about systems change, that it's a longer term vision, and that the wheels of that change it turns very, very slowly. And starting with the finding allies or working with individuals who you can potentially make allies is a very useful way of thinking about it. At the very outset of our conversation, to use the words building resilience, and just, a particular challenge I've heard recently that was very interesting to me was from some NGOs in women's rights organizations in Kenya who were talking about one of their funding challenges, and it's something that I had not thought about, is as women's rights organizations grow, and particularly in the Global South, when we think about on our African continent, that growth means that you need funding to sustain that growth. And so if the emphasis is on funding the programmatic work, you're not necessarily factoring in the sort of organizational development that has to come and move alongside that enhanced program deliverables, and that funders are generally not wanting to fund that. So tell me about when you were talking about resilience, in what context was it? Does it relate to any of this, or what are your thoughts?
Yes, so AWDF has always had what we call an accompaniment to our grantee partners, right? Which means that for every single funded partner that we have, we also provide, capacity strengthening, for lack of a better word, to them. So with every agreement that AWDF has with its own funders, there is always a significant budget line around capacity support so that we are able to provide different types of trainings to our grantee partners, depending on where they are in their growth journey as individuals, but also as organizations. And we just concluded a very exciting 2-year program that was funded by Comic Relief through FCDO, talking about bilateral funders, to essentially invest in the leadership of women who head women's rights organizations on this continent. And it was fascinating because they really had a coach that accompanied them in their leadership journey over the 2 years. And then we had series of, trainings as well for the organizations and their staff as well. One of our founders always says that AWDF does grant making from the heart, which is not just about the money, but about all the other things that organizations and individuals need to thrive, but also to be resilient in the face of crises. And we learned from COVID, right? Thinking about all the organizations that had to shut down and that kind of thing. So that's how we approach it, and that's how we encourage others to approach it as well.
Nadia, it's been invigorating talking to you. In closing, let's move from the organizational to the individual. Nadia, in the African Women's Development Fund. So what is the single biggest thing that you want to do in your role at the African Women's Development Fund?
Ooh, I think 2024 is going to be the, almost second year of implementation of our new strategy. And so I think I'm mostly just excited to see how we truly pivot our approaches, how we continue to center our movements in how we do our work while staying accountable to our funders who have been with us, on this journey. And I'm just excited about the opportunities. We have a birthday coming up for the African Feminist Forum in 2026. And so we also have some exciting things planned around reviving the African Feminist Charter and the Feminist Forum. So these are some of the things I'm excited that are in the works for the future, but that we're starting now in 2024.
I want to wish you all the best for the incredible work that you do. Thank you so much for talking to me, Nadia. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Take care.
Thank you for listening to this episode in the Prevention Collaborative's Conversation series. Head over to the podcast show notes to find resources discussed in the episode. Also, there's a link to our website where you can find curated resources on our Knowledge Hub and free courses on violence prevention in our Learning Lab. And don't forget to stay connected with us on social media. See you next time.